Okay, so welcome along, everyone. And this week we have Minhua Yan from the Karolinska Institute to talk to us about the persistence and adaptation of social norms. So thank you very much, and over to you, Minhua.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Um, like introduced, I study social norms, and I hope I don't have to convince you that social norms are important if we want to understand human behavior. We just had a talk 4 weeks ago on pretty much the same topic of how costly social norms can be maintained. And there we heard the classical example showing the power of social norms, exemplified by the duel of Alexander Hamilton. So, in 1804, Alexander Hamilton was challenged to a duel. He listed 5 reasons not to accept it, including that dueling was against his personal belief, and that his families and friends would be sad if he were hurt, and it would be irresponsible of him to accept the duel. But despite all these good reasons, he still accepted the duel, following a gentleman's honor code at the time, and the duel ended up costing his life. Now, this is just one example showcasing how powerful social norms can be. Whenever we do something because our culture has taught us that that's the right thing to do, or we do something because we think other people do the same and we should do the same, or because we think other people will approve of us if we do that, that's social norms at play. Social norms can do a lot of good things. They can facilitate coordination, like telling us which side of the road to drive on. And they can promote large-scale cooperation, like participation in warfare to defend the community's safety. Without social norms and the shared moral beliefs and payoff expectations shaped by social norms, such costly actions that are beneficial to the community but costly to the individual performing them will never be able to sustain. But then, because norms shape what we believe is right and shape the social payoffs, it can also lead to maladaptive behaviors, like foot binding and female genital cutting. Foot binding in China started in the 10th century and persisted for 1,000 years, even though it was really costly to the feet-bound women's health. It left the women with a handicap, prevented them from walking or even standing for long, caused lifelong chronic pain, and increased the mortality rate from childbirth and falling. So, without considering the cultural history that put this practice into place in the first place, and the social pressure that persisted it would be really hard to explain why such a health detrimental norm persisted for so long. But when we consider that how the cultural history and the social influence, this norm became a little bit more understandable. So the norm originated first as a historical accident, when an emperor's wife bound her feet to dance more elegantly on the lotus platform. It spread through prestige biased social learning because the elites wanted to copy the emperor's wife, and the commoners wanted to copy the elites. And once the practice was established, social pressure came in, and it was no longer a choice. It became the girl's parents' moral responsibility and the girl's future in-laws' requirement for her to have her feet bound. So, this is what my research agenda tries to address. It tries to combine cultural evolutionary theories and human behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology to understand whether and how bad norms, these are norms that are inefficient or disliked, persist. Now, in this talk, I'm gonna present a model of norm evolutionary dynamics and a piece of field work looking at how people make normative decisions and how, as a consequence, group norms change. So, to the question why bad norms can persist, or why any norm can persist, many researchers believe that it's because norms pressure people to do what others do. This can come from the need to coordinate actions, like in the car driving example, or it can come from partner choice based on norm compliance, or it can be group members actively rewarding norm compliant individuals and punishing those who don't. In the warfare example, the Trakana people participate in warfare because if they're seen as a coward, then their age mates will tie them to a tree and whip them. And to capture such pressure to do what others do, a norm is typically modeled as a coordination game. So here, the payoff matrix shows in red numbers the payoffs to a focal woman, and in blue numbers, the payoff to another woman, whose job here is to judge the focal woman based on the normative practice. And this captures the pressure to do what others do because both the focal woman and the judge receive a positive payoff only if they have the same norm practice and norm belief. Whereas if their norm traits misalign, then they both receive zero. Now, one norm is more efficient than the other. The no binding norm, because of the health benefits, gives a higher payoff if we coordinate on that than if we coordinate on the alternative norm of binding. However, because of the pressure to do what others do, both norms are stable equilibria, and they can both withstand perturbations once they're established. And the change between them only happens when the population distribution is pushed past this critical mass. And this fits the historical pattern of food binding in China. This long-held health-damaging norm was finally abolished in the 20th century, 1,000 years after its first establishment, when a coordinated revolution recruited enough supporters. But then there are norms that are always changing. For example, in the United States, the tipping norm kept increasing. And the classical norm evolution model of discrete coordination game cannot explain this kind of dynamic. So the model that I'm gonna tell you fills in this gap by identifying the key factors that determine whether a norm will persist, like food binding, or will keep changing, like tipping, under the pressure to do what others do. Now let's take another look at the discrete norm coordination game payoff matrix. Here, we're going to consider something very similar, except for the underlying behavioral option being continuous. So instead of binding or no binding as binary choices, we now look at the eventual length of the feet as a continuous variable to be the norm trait. And in the discrete coordination payoff matrix, we can decompose the eventual payoff shown in the matrix to be the product of two effects. The first is a social payoff that depends on whether the focal individual and the judge coordinate on their norm traits. So it equals to 1 if the focal's norm trait xi is equal to the judge's trait xj, and is equal to 0 otherwise. And then there is a direct health payoff. So if xi is equal to natural length, the focal individual gets a higher payoff of 2. If xi is bound length, then the payoff is 1. And the eventual payoff, when the focal individual interacts with the judge, is the product of the social payoff and the direct health payoff. Any questions so far? Okay, so we are going to do the exact same thing in our model. This way, when we see a difference in the eventual dynamics, we can pinpoint exactly what the cause is because we did the minimal changes. Now, the payoff structure will still be the eventual payoff being the product of the social payoff and the direct health payoff. But corresponding to a continuously varying norm trait, the payoffs are also continuous. The social payoff still to capture the effect of a norm pressuring people to do what others do, it peaks at zero when the trait difference between xi and xj is zero. And then the direct health payoff peaks at an optimum theta that is dependent by the ecology or our physiology and is independent of the norm's evolution. But this optimum can also indicate a psychological optimum. For example, if foot binding became an identity marker, and now binding carries more intrinsic psychological payoff than no binding, then the theta would also indicate the optimum binding given the psychological payoff. So that's the payoff. And we do a typical cultural evolution dynamics. So at the beginning of each time point, the population starts with a normal distribution of norm traits, with mu t as the mean and vt as the variance. And then each individual gets assigned a payoff. This payoff is determined by their norm trait, and as promised before, is the product of the social payoff and the direct payoff, be it from psychology or physiology. And then individuals update their norm traits based on the payoffs. So they look around and then they choose a model to copy proportional to the model's payoff. They try to adopt this model's norm trait, but then they might make an error. And this gives us the population norm trait distribution at time t plus 1 with an updated mu t plus 1 and an updated variance. So this whole process can be solved analytically because the norm trait distribution is it fits a natural it fits a normal distribution. And then the selection function are all Gaussian. And then the error just adds to the variance. So we can solve for this evolutionary process. And the result is the mean norm change in one generation or in one time point is proportional to the distance between the current mean norm, that's mu t, and the direct effect optimum theta.
Could you
All the term, yeah,
could you go back one slide as well
yes.
after you're done here, just so we can digest this a little bit? Um, so your payoffs, you've got these quadratic losses.
It's like, so here the first term is the social payoff,
Mhm.
and the second term is the direct payoff.
Yeah,
And they are both Gaussian functions. So if you do a transformation, it will be exponential of this and
yeah,
exponential of this.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah. And the first one peaks at xi minus xj is equal to 0, and the second peaks at xi minus theta is equal to
yep,
0.
yep. This is clear, and so you've got the expected payoff, and then you payoff-based blending inheritance of M models with error. So you've got this normal error
Yes.
to it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So S and D control the relative strength of social pressure and direct effect. And V is the distribution variance. So these terms are all positive. So eventually, the mean norm change in each time point is proportional to the distance between the current mean norm, mu t, and the direct effect optimum, theta. And to seek the equilibrium, we just set the left hand to be equal to 0. And because all the S and V and D terms have to be positive, this can only happen when mu t is equal to theta. So the conclusion is there is only one norm evolutionary equilibrium, and that is exactly with the population mean norm being equal to the direct effect optimum. We also looked at some extensions, including a preferred deviation. So now instead of somebody judging you the most positively when you have the exact same norm trait, they judge you the most positively when you are a certain distance away from their own norm trait. So, for example, in tipping, I don't think you're the most sensible and generous, whatever, if you tip the same amount as I do. But I think you're the most impressive and desirable social partner if you always tip 2% above what I tip, because that means you are both sensible and generous. Or this kind of preferred deviation can participate in determining the equilibrium, but it does not give us multiple stable equilibria and path dependency, like in the discrete case. We also looked at one-sided disapproval. So here, instead of judging you more and more negatively as your trait is different from mine, I only care whether you tip as much as I do. And if you do, I give you the same maximum payoff. This again does not give us path dependency. So as a short summary, there are two kinds of dynamics under the pressure of doing what others do, depending on the distribution of the underlying behavioral options. The first is the discrete kind of dynamics. And this was what people usually think about when they think about social norms and norm evolution. There can be multiple stable equilibria, and which we see in the population depends on the population's history. But by changing the underlying behavioral options from discrete to continuous, and the associated payoffs also from discrete to continuous, we discover a completely different kind of dynamic. And that is a social norm cannot be maintained by the pressure to do what others do. There is only one single equilibrium, and that equilibrium is determined only by the ecology or the physiology or the psychology. The point is, there is no historical dependency. So, using this kind of continuous norm evolutionary dynamics, we can now understand why some norms keep changing, like the tipping norm. It's because when you decide how much to tip, you can tip 18% or 20% or anything in between. It's continuous. And then there is probably a preferred deviation toward a more generous side. So this preferred deviation drives the tipping norm to keep increasing until it's checked by the economic cost of tipping so much, and then it will stabilize.
So
But yeah,
if if at the same time you have say a tipping norm that's shifting in increasing amounts like the USA, and then you have other
hmm
places where you have a fairly stable zero tipping norm like Japan or
hmm
Australia, um, how would you model that as some kind of combination of a discrete component and a continuous component of the strategy?
Yes, I think so. I'm actually gonna go to how to recover past
Oh,
dependency
okay.
from continuous
Okay.
norms right now.
Good stuff.
But I mean, I do think that zero is special. You can't just treat it as another number in the continuum. And that's why the zero norm is so stable. So
I can ask
can,
you a
yeah.
question just before you can. In these two examples, they differ also that in the tipping example, there is a party that benefits from higher tips and a party who pays for the higher tip. So from a welfare viewpoint, if you just are neutral, it doesn't change welfare who holds the money, right? If you have linear utility. What about welfare aspects of this example with foot length? What are the welfare properties of your dynamic? You had a unique stable state, right? A unique stationary state is what can you say about welfare properties?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question. So you're saying that
You,
in the tipping example,
if I take the case with the discrete and the coordination game you have two possible stationary states there. One is Pareto efficient. It maximizes the utility. The sum is 2. Everybody earns 2. In the other one, another one which is welfare inferior. Now you got a unique equilibrium when you had a continuum description. What about its welfare properties in general? With the discrete model, you could get social efficiency or non-efficiency, right?
yes.
In continuum case, what can you say then about efficiency?
So I mean, I think I guess in the tipping example, it's kind of true that the money is in either in my pocket or in your pocket, and it doesn't really matter that much to the total social
No,
efficiency whether you tip
and it is not.
20%
It
or
is not a game. It is
25%.
not really a game. I mean, it's just one side, the decision problem, right?
I mean, it is a game in the sense that there is a pressure and there is a,
Yeah,
I mean, if you're interacting with some partner, then you would have
true. Yeah,
to adjust your behavior based on what they might think the best behavior
right.
is.
But in the other case, with your coordination game, you have to interact with one individual at a time, right?
So in all these examples, well, I mean, our model is formulated as you interacting with one individual at a time, and then your social payoff is the aggregate, the expected payoff from interacting with a randomly selected partner. But I think you can always think of a social norm as a binary partner choice scenario. I mean, in tipping, you're trying to impress the person that you're going to dinner with. And in foot binding, you're trying to impress your one single future husband's parents.
Right. But in the discrete case, we have the results by Pate and Yang, for example, that both are possible norms, but the bigger relation of attraction is for the more
Yes.
in this case, the Pareto efficient, and in your continuum case, you have only one equilibrium. So I just was curious if what one can say about the welfare properties of that. That's all.
So I mean, I think that's one important finding of this piece of work, that in the discrete norm kind of dynamics, we do have multiple stable equilibria. I mean, it's true that the basin of attraction of the more efficient norm will be bigger and is stochastically dynamically stable. But then if error is pushed to be small, which is what the dynamic stability requires you to do, then we will also take forever to get out of the inefficient social norm. But here in the continuous norm evolutionary kind of dynamics, I guess you can think of it as an extreme case of the discrete kind of dynamics. So each norm, because it's continuous, it takes a basin of attraction that is essentially with a size of 0. So each single continuous norm is neutrally stable. It can sustain if there is absolutely no force impacting it. But then, because the basin of attraction is so small, any kind of force will move it to the next norm, which is also neutrally stable. And it's through these from one norm to the next micro steps that led us always eventually to the more efficient norm. So, I mean, I think, yes, in the tipping example, it's true that nothing is more socially efficient. But in the model formulation, we are doing the exact same comparison between continuous versus discrete. So, I mean, if you look at this, then some norms are more efficient. The norms that are closer to the optimum theta are the more efficient norms. The ones farther away from it are less efficient. Does that answer your question?
Not exactly, but let's leave it now. Let's go on. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So going back to how come the zero tipping norm is so stable? We do have a dilemma in that there are a lot of social norms in the world that, if you look closely enough, are continuous, like foot binding. You can quantify foot binding as the eventual length of the feet or the age of binding, but they don't evolve like what we predicted about continuous social norms and keep changing generation after generation until it reaches the direct effect optimum. Instead, the foot binding norm did persist for a long time. So we need to somehow recover multiple stable equilibria and path dependency from continuous norms. And we found that one mechanism is to have mental categorization, such that neighboring traits are treated the same in social evaluation and all assign the same payoff. But across category boundaries, the social payoff changes dramatically. If there are only a few categories and they're big enough, then we can recover path dependency from the pressure to do what others do on continuous social norms. Another possibility is if we have multiple cognitive attractors that are implemented as multiple optima in the direct effect. There, we can also recover path dependency from continuous norms. So, as a conclusion, from our theoretical model, we get these insights about the question whether and how bad norms can persist. Only under the pressure to do what others do, discrete norms can persist, but norms with continuously distributed variance cannot persist. It will evolve to the individual optimum. And because continuously distributed norms always go to the individual optimum, not only can bad norms not persist, but those hyper good norms, like individually costly contribution to public goods, can also not persist. So if we want individually costly continuous norms to persist, we need additional mechanisms, like moral preferences, implemented as preferred deviation or one-sided disapproval, or mental categorization in the social evaluation, or cognitive attractors. So that's the theoretical work. To document the evolutionary dynamics of discrete and continuous norms empirically, I established my field site with the Derung people and focused on 4 norms that span the discrete to continuous spectrum. So for religiosity, there are pretty much 2 options among the Derung people right now. Either you are a Protestantist or you are an atheist. Whereas for the continuous ends of the norms, we have sharecropping contracts and co-farming harvest division contracts, because you can give any percentage of your harvest to the landlord or to your co-farming partners. Sharecropping is a little bit more discreet because whether to pay the landlord at all, there is probably a mental categorization or cognitive attractor towards zero going on there. Now, the community that I work with is called the Derung people. The Derung people live at the border of China and Myanmar. The yellow line shows the border. They live along this river called the Derung River, shown in blue here, in these white regions. In China, Derung people live in 6 different villages. From north to south and also upstream to downstream, those are Dizhengdang, Longyuan, Xianjiudang, Kongdang, Bapu, and Maku. Upstream Derung people and downstream Derung people historically had very little contact, and therefore maintained different dialects and different norms. I conducted fieldwork in both the most upstream village Dizhengdang and the most downstream village Maku, but today I will only talk about one village, Dizhengdang. So historically, the Derung people had very little contact with the outside market because they lived in these deep mountain ranges. But this changed when the Chinese government constructed a 35-kilometer long tunnel for them in 2014. This tunnel granted Chinese Derung people year-round access, and since then, all kinds of changes happened. And that's why I picked this field site to study norm changes. Derung people historically performed Sweden horticulture and complemented it with hunting, fishing, and gathering. When horticulture was performed by several households, upstream Derung people and downstream Derung people had different deviation traditions. In the upstream, no matter whether the households contributed the same number of laborers or whether one household provided the land, the harvest was equally divided among the participating households. Whereas in downstream Derung regions, the harvest was divided equally in proportion to the number of frequently attending laborers. And in both regions, providing the land did not give you a bigger share. But recent changes are challenging these norms. For example, the wage labor opportunity made labor more valuable. And if you still want people to contribute the now more valuable labor into co-farming, then the upstream norm will probably have to start rewarding labor contribution. In addition, the Derung people signed a sloping land conversion contract with the Chinese government. This contract asked them to give up all their farming land on slopes greater than 25 degrees. And as a result, the Derung people gave up 97% of their land. So now land is also more valuable. And this challenges both the upstream and the downstream regions' tradition of not rewarding land contribution. When I went to the field in 2018, Derung villagers still co-farmed. The ideal arrangement was for each household to contribute the same number of laborers. But households with different numbers of laborers still co-farmed. And if somebody misses work due to illnesses or having other work or other responsibilities, they still received an equal share. And sometimes additional laborers from a household can work on this co-farmed land every day, but they did not receive an additional share of harvest because they were considered helpers. Now, in this video, you can see how equal division by household happens. The video was speed up to save time. So these two households are co-farming corn. The lady in blue contributed 2 laborers, while the lady in rainbow contributed only 1. Now, what they do during dividing is they use a smaller measuring basket. They fill it up, and then they pour the harvest into the basket of one household. And then they refill the basket, and they pour it into the basket of the other household. And this process continued until all the harvest was divided. And this was not just one rare instance of equal division by household that I happened to have caught on camera. I asked people to report how they divided the harvest from their real-life co-farming. And the x-axis quantified the divisions as the harvest share difference between households getting the most and the least. So 0 would mean all the households get the same amount, whereas 20% would mean if there were two households co-farming, one household got 40% and the other household got 60%. And we can see that although now both land and labor are more valuable, most co-farming partnerships still followed equal division by household. So this contradicted the prediction from my model. Now, if you believe my model, let's think about what should happen. It should be that most people divided equally by household previously, but due to social learning error, there were some that divided even more to the household that had fewer labor contribution, and some partnerships that divided less to those that contributed less labor. But as the optimum changes, the norm should immediately respond. And now the model harvest division should have already shifted toward rewarding labor contribution and land contribution. But this is not what we saw. Now, part of this is contributed by equal division by household being a cognitive attractor, and people preferably adopting this as long as the labor contribution is not that different. That I won't talk about today. But I mean, what I did empirically was to test another important assumption from the model that led to my prediction. And that was people were updating their normative traits based on the payoffs. Because if people did not update their normative traits based on the payoffs, then we would totally see this pattern where although labor and land were more valuable, people were still adhering to their tradition. So this is why I studied individual norm decision making, although my longer term goal was to document norm changes. And specifically, I want to test the role of these three forms of payoffs in people's decision making. This is slightly modified from Christina Beatrice's framework. So a person's normative behavior is driven by ecological payoffs, psychological payoffs, and social payoffs. The psychological payoffs are calculated by comparing one's normative preference. This is what one believes one should do to the available behavior options. And whichever minimizes the difference gives the highest psychological payoff. And then social payoffs are estimated based on what the person believes others believe one should do, and what the person believes other people are doing. So, how exactly do Derung people consider these payoffs in their normative decision making? I conducted two research activities to answer this question. First is an automaton game framed as co-farming harvest division to check how people make decisions in a controlled setting. And second is semi-structured interviews based on people's real-life co-farming practices. So let's look at the automaton game first. The automaton game was framed as co-farming harvest division, and it had two conditions. So does anybody need me to introduce the automaton game? If not, I'll just proceed. Okay, so in this automaton game, there were two conditions. In the control condition, the proposers and the responders were told to base their decisions on this co-farming scenario. That the proposer's household had two people living there, and these two people went to work every day. The responder's household also had two people living there, and two people went to work. And the proposer was asked to divide 50 jin of rice, which was equal to 25 kg of rice, or the wage for 1 day of intense labor work. In the 2-to-1 condition, this is where we're going to test how exactly people think of the ecological cost of still dividing equally by household, regardless of labor contribution. we give people another co-farming arrangement. And that is the proposer's household had two laborers. And these two were also the consumers that ate the food. The responder's household had only one person. This one person ate the food and this one person went to work. So both the labor contribution and the needs of the households clearly differed in this 2-to-1 condition. Now, when we look at the proposer's offers in the 2-to-1 condition, we can see that most people still divided equally by household, even though the labor contribution and the needs so clearly differed. So the x-axis are the offers, quantified as the amount out of 50 offered to the responder. So 25 out of 50 would be equal division by household, and 17 out of 50 would be the closest division that you can get to equal division by labor contribution. And by far, most people divided equally by household. Okay, so in the automaton game, the pairing of responder and proposer were random, and all the decisions were anonymous. So there should be no kin selection or reciprocity or reputation considerations. So a reasonable first guess would be that people divided by household because they still preferred it. Well, this was not the case. I asked people in a post-game survey what they thought the best division in the 2-to-1 condition was. And most people said the best division was to divide equally by laborer. Okay, so people were doing something that they themselves did not prefer. Could it be a pluralistic ignorance story? Could be that people mistakenly thought other people preferred equal division by household. Well, again, not the case. In the post-game survey, I also asked people to guess what most others in the village would say the best division was in the 2-to-1 condition. And most people accurately guessed that most others would say equal division by laborer, the alternative division, different from the tradition, was the best. Okay, so not people's own normative preferences and not people's expectations about others' normative preferences that are contributing to their norm compliance. Could it be social payoff considerations that although they knew others no longer preferred the tradition, they were worried that given this was the tradition, their responders would reject their offer if they had made a lower offer? Again, not the case. So I used the strategy method to elicit the responders' acceptance range. And we can see that equal division by household, indicated by green here, was as frequently accepted as the equal division by laborer offer, shown in pink here. And what was the most frequently accepted was actually an in-between offer. That's 20 out of 50. So as a proposer in the 2-to-1 condition, you can actually deviate quite a bit toward a selfish side and still have your offer accepted. Now, I did not ask people what they expected the acceptance range of their matched responder would be. But the Derung society really emphasizes harmony. So it's a known fact that once a request is made, it's very rarely rejected. And also, people did not cite worrying about responder rejection as a motivation for following the tradition. So I think it's pretty strong evidence that it was not the social cost or the potential social cost that motivated people to follow the tradition. Now, puzzled by people's behavior, I asked those people that divided equal by household in the 2-to-1 condition, although they preferred equal division by laborer and expected others to prefer equal division by labor. Why they divided equally by household. And all 8 respondents said something along this line. What people think is just what people think. When we do things, we do what we have always been doing, suggesting not payoff considerations driving the behavior, but a preference to follow the tradition and the common practice. The second line of evidence from semi-structured interviews based on people's real-life co-farming practices suggested the same pattern. So when I asked people to vote for a norm to follow from now on, most people voted for equal division by laborer. And when I asked people to guess how their partners would react if they were to propose selfish alternative division proposals, most people guessed that their partners would agree to accept this alternative division proposal, therefore giving them more, would not get upset, would not complain to others, and would not end the co-farming. Only very few suggested that their partners would either refuse to divide the alternative way or end the co-farming partnership. And again, people's subjective reports on why they followed equal division by household in real-life co-farming suggested a tradition compliance tendency. So most people said that they divided equally by household because it was the traditional and common practice. And then there are additional justifications like it's fair, it's non-calculating, or it's just simply good, potentially explaining why some people still prefer equal division by household. And there are sometimes justifications based on normative expectations. That is, their partners would prefer equal division by household. And some justifications involving relationships with the partners, because these are real-life co-farming, and they got to choose their partners. So kin selection and reciprocity effects do come into consideration. So as a summary, to accurately depict how the Derung villagers decide their normative behavior, we have to modify this chart. For a small proportion of people, they prefer the norm, whether it's because of some norm internalization process or something else. I don't have an answer to that. But for this small proportion of people, they do prefer equal division by household. And this practice gives them the highest ecological payoff. So doing what maximizes their psychological payoff will lead to their norm compliant behavior. For most others, though, they have already updated their preference based on the ecological payoffs. So when they follow their psychological payoffs from the updated normative preference, it will lead to norm non-compliant behavior. But most people that have updated their normative preference do not follow the psychological payoffs. Instead, they look at what they have always been doing and what other people around them are still doing, and then they base their decisions on that. So we need to add a big arrow going from expectations about others' behavior directly to norm compliant behavior. Now, I haven't talked about how ecological payoffs can directly impact normative behavior. This can happen if those co-farming partnerships that harvested more are more likely to persist or are more likely to be copied by naive individuals trying to learn a co-farming division contract. So to quantify the ecological payoffs of co-farming arrangements, I asked 5 local collaborators to visit 65 households at the end of every day for 8 months through 2020's farming cycle, and ask what each member did for how long and with whom. And if they either harvested or gathered, I asked them how much they harvested or gathered. And this was verified by my local collaborators measuring the actual harvests. And I also asked them to report goods exchanges and money flows to quantify the social network and the importance of farming in terms of all economic behavior and co-farming in terms of farming. So among other things, this can tell us how exactly costly eco-division by household is in the current ecological conditions, because we can see whether because labor participation is not rewarded, there are additional laborers just resting at home, not contributing to the co-farming efforts. And we can see whether co-farming harvest division is actually costly to the household that contributed more labor, or whether they are exchanging additional harvest in co-farming arrangements for goods or favors in other domains. Now, as a short summary, to answer the question, can bad norms persist? From the fieldwork, I found that in Derung co-farming harvest division, conformity or social learning psychology play a greater role than payoff considerations in people's decision making. And bad norms can persist due to such conformity and social learning psychology. But the question is, for how long? So the long-term goal is to document the norm changes. So I went back into the field in 2025 and redid the ultimatum game. And we can see that there is some indication of the behavior continually shifting away from equal division by household toward rewarding labor contributions, although the change is not statistically significant. What I found more interesting and also surprising was how the preference changed. So remember that in 2019, in the first round of the ultimatum game, most people said equal division by laborer was the better division. But this time, more people said equal division by household was the better division. And if you compare people's behavior with their stated preferences, it's a pretty good match. So it seems that people's preference has shifted back toward their tradition, away from what's ecologically sensible. Now, I think this might be due to two reasons. First is due to market integration and government efforts, the Derung people are now richer, and they rely less on their own produced food. So the ecological pressure on different division arrangements has relaxed. And secondly, because of all the cultural contacts with other groups and the fast market integration, many Derung practices are in active loss. So their cultural identity of being a Derung and doing something different might be more salient than others, than other times. And this might have contributed to them internalizing the tradition in their preference. Now, this surprising finding was actually very unexpected. As a matter of fact, I did not expect the norm to change so fast either. I went back to the field this time to answer this question. When people follow tradition, why exactly are they following tradition? And I came up with 4 different hypotheses, and I would really appreciate people's thoughts on additional mechanisms. One is uncertainty. So maybe people still follow the tradition in the 2-to-1 condition of the ultimatum game because although they thought most others would prefer equal division by laborer, they weren't certain. And due to risk aversion or loss aversion, they chose the safer option of just doing what others have always been doing. Another motivation was partner disappointment. Maybe they followed equal division by household because they knew their partners would expect equal division by household, and they did not want to disappoint their partners. One hypothesis that I formed but did not test was group identity. And I may test this shortly in the near future by recruiting only those people that deviated from the tradition and telling them that now this game was to introduce their own ideologies to the world and see whether under this kind of framing they bring their deviation behavior back toward tradition. And the fourth possibility was the norm was simply a cognitive shortcut. It was the default. And when you adopted the norm, it involved fewer calculations. So it was easier and a salient solution. So here, I wanted to give people equal deviation by labor as the starting point, but I could not figure out a legitimate way for people to believe this is now the new default. So what I eventually did was the first two treatments. By giving people a dictator's game instead of an automaton game with the same co-farming harvest deviation framing. And by telling the proposers that the responders knew the typical harvest from each year. But this year, suddenly the harvest boosted, and there was more that the proposer could divide. These two treatments did not have an effect. So we can rule out risk aversion and partner disappointment avoidance as motivations for tradition compliance. Additional explanations will need to be tested, and I welcome your thoughts on even more possible explanations. Lastly, I want to thank my local collaborators. These are Derung villagers that contributed to the data collection effort. My other collaborators, the funding institutes, and all the Derung participants and non-participants. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Minhua. I shall stop the recording.